Mastering the art of effective backgrounds is one of the fastest ways to improve your photography. Pictures with distracting backgrounds have an amateur snapshot look, while intentional thought-through backgrounds instantly lift the entire composition to a higher level. Backgrounds should be used to highlight the subject in a context that helps them to stand out, without being overwhelming. We want more than just a background. We want them to be blurred, but not any blurred background will do. Once in a while, a uniform, flat-colored background can be okay, but most of the times we want something more interesting. For me, the background is as important as the flowers themselves. Without a good, interesting background, the images are less appealing. The background completes the story by creating a dreamy, almost mystical mood. They really help to set the feel of the image. I want my backgrounds to really help to tell the story and to add an extra dimension. In this, the background and foreground bokeh, or in other words, the out of focus areas, play a very important role. For me, there are three kinds of bokeh. You have the circular highlight bokeh, the out of focus shapes, and finally, the bokeh created by color contrasts. Out of focus specular highlight areas in the background result in circular highlight bokeh. In these examples, you see clearly how the highlights turn into a beautiful circular bokeh. So the more these highlights are out of focus, the more they fade into their surroundings, and the softer the edges will be. The highlight area should be surrounded by some darker areas to blend in when blurred. Otherwise you will end up with a background like this one. The image is shot at f3.2, but the highlights in the background don't result in circular highlights, because they blend into each other. Also here for this orchid, the highlight areas are too big, so they blend into each other. Just by recomposing and searching a smaller specular highlight, you can improve the image. Small changes in your background composition can make a huge difference. And remember, the highlights in the background should not be too big or too many. You don't want them to blend into each other. This image has a beautiful soft circular highlight bokeh. It is shot at f2.8. Now, if we close down the aperture to f4, you notice that the circular highlights become smaller. But they also become a little brighter, as they don't blend as much into their surroundings. Closing further down to f5.6, to f9, and finally to f16 results in smaller, less attractive circular highlights. They have a harder edge and a brighter center, with sometimes blown out highlights. So, wider apertures result in softer and more dreamy backgrounds. The second type of bokeh are the out of focus shapes. That's anything in the background or foreground that is out of focus but not totally blurred. There's still some recognizable shapes, like you can see in these images. It could be only a hint of the subject, like these out of focus flowers. This results in a minimalistic image with a wonderful mystical look. In other images, the shapes can be more obvious, like over here. The flowers are blurred, but are still recognizable as flowers. The out of focus areas should not compete with our main flower. We want them to stay secondary and use them to complete the story we want to tell. It could also be the forest in the background that helps to tell the whole story, like in this image over here. And here in this image we have a combination of the shapes of the tree and the flower in the background, combined with some circular highlights. These blurred background shapes not only help to tell the story, but they also give the image extra depth. Then we have our third type, the color contrast bokeh. In this type, objects in the back or foreground have lost all recognizable shape. there's only colors blending into each other. This may be the most beautiful of the three types of bokeh. It can really create a dreamy, mystical look and adds a lot of mood to the image, like in these images. The bright colors of the flower and the vegetation in the foreground, combined with the out of focus background colors, really wrap around the flower. It's like an explosion of colors. Or in this picture of a moorland spotted orchid that seems to float in tones of yellow and green. Most of the bokeh is created by the grasses in the background and a little in the foreground. On other times it's only the background that blends together, like in this image. The grasses behind the poppy lose their shape. The background has become no more than a vertical pattern of green tones. In this kind of bokeh, the foreground can play a very important role. By blurring the foreground, it can throw a veil of color around the subject, sometimes partly in front of our subject. This can give a wonderful effect and is discussed later on in the techniques section. Shooting through is an amazing technique that uses parts of the foreground to create a beautiful veil of color wrapping around the flower. These kind of bokeh can really lift your photography to a higher level. Now there are 4 factors that affect the background sharpness. These are the aperture, the focal length of your lens, the distance between the subject and the background, and the distance to your focus point. The aperture we already discussed more in detail. The wider your aperture, the more out of focus your background will be and the more beautiful and dreamy your background can become. Then the focal length of your lens. The longer your lens, the shallower your depth of field will become, and thus the more out of focus your background will be. Let's have a look at this poppy. Composition and aperture for the 2 images are the same. They're both shot at f2.8. The first image is shot with a 100mm lens and the second one with a 200mm lens. The highlight bokeh with the 100mm is smaller and the edges are harder. I like the 200mm version more. The highlight surrounds the whole flower and the edges are a lot softer. Now, the distance between the subject and the background. The closer your background, the more it will be in focus. Here you see a picture of the flower. And now when I move the flower closer and closer to the background, you see that there's more and more detail in the background. This means that sometimes when your background is too close to your subject, you won't succeed in getting a nice out of focus background. Sometimes it's best to just select a different flower. Now, also the distance to your focus point has a huge impact on the sharpness of your background. The closer you get in, the shallower your depth of field will become, and the softer your background will be. Now, these 3 images were shot with my 100mm lens at f2.8. You see the background becoming softer when I get in closer. So getting in closer could be an option if you want a more blurred background. This all means that in one way or another, we photographers have a lot of control over our background blur. The better we understand how these factors influence our background, the more we will be able to create wonderful flower portraits. Before continuing, I'll ask you to subscribe to our newsletter. And you'll receive a series of free videos full of macro photography tips right into your mailbox. And next to that, discount codes on my masterclasses. The Flower Art Photography Masterclass and the Multiple Exposure Macro Photography Masterclass. So click the link below the video. Okay, let's continue. Now, we've already seen that a shallow depth of field really helps to let the flower stand out and separate it from the background. But that's not the only tool we can use to draw all attention to our subject. Another important aspect of our backgrounds is their brightness and color composition. Contrasting backgrounds can easily add interest to your images. They really help to draw the attention onto your subject. Use color and tonal contrast to let your flower stand out from the background. Here I separate the flower from the background by incorporating tonal or color contrast. Now all attention is drawn to the flower, as it totally stands out from the background. When composing images, search for a background with varying shades and tones, and choose color contrast to let your subject stand out. Now, another option that can give very interesting results is just the opposite of these contrasting backgrounds. By blending the flower into the background, you will get a more intimate, dreamy look. Tone-on-tone images can sometimes be dull and boring, but when applied well, it gives stunning results. Here I go minimal, and the flower almost disappears in the background. Only a hint of the flower is visible. This powerful technique creates a lot of mystery in the image, as you can see over here. Only the essence of the flowers is revealed. Here you have another example, where the flower and the background have the same colors. The blur in this kind of tone-on-tone images really lets the flowers fade into the background. Now all distractions have been eliminated, leaving only the spirit of the flowers. Now, not all backgrounds can be blurred into a wonderful bouquet. When looking for flowers to shoot, I always pay as much attention to the possible backgrounds as to the flowers themselves. Even if it's a perfect flower, without a good background I probably won't shoot it. For me, that would be like shooting a perfect out of focus background without a good subject in front of it. The flower is as important as the background, and only in symbiosis they result in stunning images. You have to learn which backgrounds will work and which won't.